Welcome, viewers. Welcome again to a special edition of the Geo interview. We have with us today Ambassador Shyam Saran, who is a former Foreign Secretary and has served as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. Ambassador Saran has also been the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. So, Ambassador, we are delighted to have you with us and welcome once again.
Thank you. Thank you. Very happy to be speaking to all of you.
So today, the Geostrata will be having a conversation with Ambassador Saran on their recent book, How China Sees India and the World. So we will like to get right into it. So Ambassador, you had served in the ministry for a long time. And now you tackle very hands-on issues in IR. But then after that, you delved into history and you try to analyze approaches in IR using a historical lens and seeing the entire trajectory of China, for example. So how has this intellectual exercise changed your approach to issues in IR, international relations? And what would you have done today, which would have been different than you were if you were a foreign secretary today compared to then, after this intellectual exercise that you have engaged in?
One, I would like to, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. And I'm very happy that we will be talking about my latest book, which is essentially trying to decode what is the prism through which China looks at not just India, but looks at the world at large. And how is that particular perspective being determined by historical factors, certain cultural factors, geographical factors, all those aspects, then over a period of time, build the, as I said, through a lens through which China looks at the world around itself. This is not a scholarly book. I mean, if you want to really know the history of China, then you should look at many more accomplished historians who have written about the history of China. The reason why I wrote this book was essentially that the general educated Indian, to my mind, has very little knowledge about China, very little familiarity with China. Maybe a handful of diplomats, maybe a few scholars, but essentially a large part of the educated section of Indians know very little about China. And considering the fact that China is already, but also is going to be one of the most significant challenges that India will confront, it is, to my mind, very important that we should have some greater familiarity. Why does China think the way it does? Why does China conduct itself in the manner it does, not only towards India, but, for example, to its other neighbors? Why does it see its rivalry with the United States of America, for example, as almost an existential kind of a rivalry? So what explains that? Because unless you can explain that, it is very difficult through just IR theory, as we learn it in our colleges and universities. IR theory does not have much to offer in this context. IR theory works as long as you put it in the larger cultural, larger historical context. So this is something which is very important for students of IR to understand. They should not look at everything is explicable as long as we know the theory. No, the theory can only help you if you understand the context within which that analysis is being done. So what I have tried to do in this book is to provide you with that context. Once you have this context, then you can use your IR theory, the principles of international relations. There may be elements which are realist theory. There are elements which are constructivist theory. There are several ways of actually analyzing events. But this context is very important. So that's really the reason why I wrote this book.
Thank you, Ambassador. So the context is clear now. And within this context, you have mentioned in chapter 1 that India is a retreating image in China's rear view of the world. So what led you to this conclusion after analyzing Chinese history and then coming to the present? And also, if India is a retreating image in Chinese view, how much will this image change after the Ukraine war and then the formations that we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific and India's overtures to the Indo-Pacific, the IPEF, all these formations. So we would like to understand your perspective based on the Chinese conception of India and then what's happening lately.
So the reason why I use that particular simile, that is India being a retreating image in China's rear view mirror, is because China is very much looking at its relationships through what IR experts would say is a balance of power kind of perspective. They believe that it is the correlation of forces. It is the kind of balance in terms of economic capabilities, military capabilities, technological capabilities. These determine what the Chinese say is their comprehensive national power. So for the last 40 years, China has been precisely engaged in building up its comprehensive national power. And so today it is the second largest economy in the world, just behind the United States of America. It is certainly the second most powerful country as far as the military assets are concerned. And even as far as technology is concerned, there are certain important new areas of technology, like, for example, artificial intelligence, machine learning, aerospace, biomedical field. In all these fields, China is investing very heavily in order to become a leading player in these domains. So the China's sense of itself is that we are already in the category of a great power, not just a major power, but we are a great power. So we are ahead of the others. We may be slightly behind the United States, but we are ahead of everybody else. So this is why they have a kind of a ranking that, for China, important thing is major power relationships, essentially the relationship with the United States of America. Secondly, the neighbors, because periphery is very important. Therefore, China must manage that periphery well. Other developing countries, number 3, and international organizations like the UN, number 4. So they sort of rank these various relationships according to what, in the terms of power, which are the most influential. So the benchmarking that they do for China today is with the United States of America. Okay. So in that context, they consider themselves to already be in the big league. And today they will tell India that, as I have mentioned in the book, that yes, the relationship between India and China today is very different from what it may have been 30 years ago or 40 years ago or even 10 years ago, because we are 5 times your size. Our GDP is 5 times your size. Therefore, you should realize that this will inevitably have an impact on the nature of the relationship between India and China. Meaning thereby that you should know your place, that you are a junior player. We are the senior player. So it is in that context I have used that term, that from the Chinese perspective, I am not suggesting that India is actually behind, but what I'm suggesting is that the way the Chinese are looking at India is that, look, you are in the minor league now. We are the test players, as it were, to use a cricketing term. We are playing in the tests. You are maybe first class cricket, but you are not in the test category. So this asymmetry of power that China perceives, therefore colors a lot of the kind of postures which they adopt towards India. The language that they use in describing India, or in also, the kind of expectations that they have of India-China relations. So this is something important, because I have said in the book that the Chinese concept of power is very hierarchical. So they see that you cannot have a multipolar world. I mean, they may be using the rhetoric of multipolarity, but in reality, they don't believe in multipolarity. What they believe is in a very hierarchical sense of power. And in that hierarchical sense, they see themselves certainly almost at the top. They are certainly looking at themselves as the dominant power in Asia, and with the possibility of becoming the dominant power globally, even though they may not be there at this point of time. So that's the context in which I've used that term.
Perfect. Okay. And now, given this context of how China wants to see India, you have written in your book that China's contemporary rise, I'm quoting you, China's contemporary rise is indeed remarkable, but does not entitle it to claim a fictitious centrality bestowed upon it by history. Could you talk about why do you think that this reality is fictitious for China, and what actually it conceives of itself, and what are those gaps in this thinking, and why is it fictitious?
So it is fictitious because while China through history was a very large country, it was in many ways one of the more prosperous countries in the world. With respect to some areas on its periphery, it was also the dominant power, a dominant cultural influence, for example. So if you're looking at, say, a country like Korea, or you look at a country like, say, Japan, they are very much in cultural debt to China. Vietnam for many years was under Chinese occupation, and its culture, yes, has been very much influenced by China. But beyond this, it is not as if China was a kind of a far-flung empire which incorporated virtually the whole of Asia. Certainly not Southeast Asia, as I have tried to point out in the book, that if we are looking at the relative influence of, say, India and China with regard to, say, Southeast Asia, there is no doubt that there is a greater influence, greater imprint of India on Southeast Asia, not so much of China, beyond what is maybe called the Sinosphere, Japan and Korea and Vietnam. So to say that China was always the dominant power in Asia and was deferred to by other countries in the region, and therefore what is happening today is China is only going back to its natural position of dominance in Asia. This is what I'm contesting, that there was no centrality with respect to China's position, historically speaking, even if China was a very important country. Or when we are talking about, say, the Belt and Road Initiative, China says, well, it's like recreating in a modern context the old Silk Road. Now, when you say the old Silk Road, because the word silk is used, so it appears that the whole ancient trading was all dominated by China, and silk was the main commodity, which again is not true, because the Silk Road is not one road. Silk Road were a whole network of roads which connected China, but also connected India, Central Asian countries, Persia, the ancient Persia, going up to the Mediterranean. So there were many players in that particular old trading system. And just as China's silk was an important commodity of exchange, so was, say, Indian cotton. So were spices, for example, from Southeast Asia and also from India. There was also very, very fine goods which were produced in the ancient Persian Empire, which were also part and parcel of this trade. So there were many commodities being exchanged, and there were many routes which were being followed, of which China was also a participant. This is not to say China had no role to play, but it is not as if there was a certain centrality of China as far as that network of trading routes were concerned. The suggestion is Silk Road, silk, China being the most important trading nation. That is not what history tells us. So to say, for example, that the Belt and Road Initiative is a recreation of the ancient, Silk Road, of which China was the central point, that history is not actually authentic history. So what I'm trying to put across is that today's China's prosperity is really derived from the globalization of the Chinese economy. By being a very open economy, borrowing capital, technology, knowledge from many other centers of excellence, and then, yes, utilizing it in the most effective way possible in order to become what it is today. But it is not that this particular status, the legitimacy should be sought from history, because the history is not as what China says it is.
And the fact that this history that China is propelling in the global stage is being accepted by some corners in almost all countries. What does this portray, and how can this be rectified?
You see, nobody usually, in terms of public perception, nobody delves deep into history to see, is this really correct or is this not correct? See, we all go by impressions. Whether those impressions are really based on actual history or actual fact, that is not always the case. I mean, even today, you see social media, what it comes out, the kind of picture it creates, may have very little to do with reality.
Yeah.
So certain kinds of broad impressions are created. Sometimes impressions are created for, contemporary political reasons. So I have pointed out that, there was a phase when China and, say, the United States were almost like allies. From 1972 onwards, since the visit of President Nixon to China, right up to at least 1989, when the Tiananmen, riots took place. This was a period of great bonhomie between China and the United States. And there was an effort on the part of Western scholarship to try and boost China's image, to try and say, this is a very, very important ally, which is also historically been a very important country. Okay, so there is a certain kind of effort to try and create a narrative, which is a much more positive narrative, because of the fact that China is an ally. Now, after 1989, slowly you see that the negative element in the perception start coming. So we have to, as students of IR, as scholars, analysts, we have to try and make sure that we look behind those narratives. Why is a certain narrative being created? Is it really based on history, on actual facts? And if it is not, then what is the purpose of creating a certain narrative? So what narratives do is every country tries to create a narrative about itself. It tries to create a more expansive image of itself. It tries to create a more positive image of itself. It sometimes airbrushes history that, there may not be a continuous kind of a history of starting from a modest beginning and then like a linear process coming to where you are. Most of history, whether it is India or China, we have gone through phases of fragmentation. We have gone through phases of unity. We have gone through phases of actually being ruled by alien, tribes or alien ethnic groups. So both of us have very complex histories. So it is not as if in India there is a continuous history right from the ancient days to the present. Or that in China's case, it is the same, starting from a glorious history of Zhou dynasty coming to the present, as if this is a inevitable ascent in history. That is not the reality. So what I have tried to show is that we see this narrative, we see what story China is telling about itself, and then it is up to us to try and see what lies behind it. Is it based on real history? Is it based on some myth making, storytelling in a sense? And if it is a certain narrative which is being created, why is that narrative being created?
This is all the more reason, Ambassador, for every capital to have a copy of your book. And
I don't know about that, but anyway, I mean, it's my effort to try and at least for the general reader, as I said, this is not a scholarly work. This is for a general reader to give them a certain sense of why China, as I said, conducts itself the way it does, and what are some of the historical factors which go into making that kind of a perspective.
yeah, perfect, exactly. And I'm glad to capture this perspective in your book. And also, there's a very pertinent thing that you say, that scholars do not see the irony of China's blaming the Indians' supposedly deficient character for falling prey to foreign rule. But then you also go on to state about some facts about the Mongol rule in 12th and 13th centuries, and then the Manchus, Qing, and then how technically in history Tibet, Xinjiang, these are not part of China, but these are part of larger empires. Could you please brief our audience on this very important observation?
Take a more recent example. You have the British Indian Empire. The British Indian Empire at one time also included, say, Burma. Okay. Now, does that entitle India to say that, this is part and parcel of historical India? It is not. So it's a similar kind of a situation with respect to, say, Tibet or to Xinjiang. It may have been part and parcel of an empire ruling over China and these territories. But doesn't mean that because China was a part of, say, the Mongol Empire, or China was the part of the Manchu Empire, therefore the successor Chinese state therefore has a legitimate claim over these territories. So this is the point I'm trying to make, that if you see the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the first stirrings of nationalism were really anti-Manchu. They were not an anti-colonial or anti-imperialist struggle. They were really trying to fight against an alien rule by the Manchus. Just as India was fighting, alien rule of the British. But what then happened was that because that Manchu Empire had these various, territories under its rule, at some point of time, the Manchu Empire was, in a sense, Sinicized. It became part and parcel of the longer stream of Chinese history. So it was no longer alien. Or when they argue that, for example, Tibet, at least for some time, they claimed Tibet because under Mongol rule it was under the rule of Beijing. Now the fact is that yes, Tibet was a vassal state to the then Mongol Empire, the Yuan dynasty, but so was China. So it was not as if, the Yuan dynasty ruling China incorporated this into the Chinese, into China itself. No. Now, what happens in retelling that history is, whichever part of territory which was under some Chinese empire, Han or non-Han, logically belongs to China. That justification is what needs to be contested. So this is something which you see the change, that the first nationalist stirrings begin against the Manchus, and then you see how it gets changed over a period of time, where the alien aspect of Manchu is forgotten, or it is not played up anymore, and they become like another Chinese dynasty. Just as the Yuan dynasty has become another Chinese dynasty. So as Chinese dynasties, they have claim to Tibet. They have claim to Mongolia. They have claim to Xinjiang. But these were not part and parcel originally of the Chinese state under alien rule.
I see. And based on that, in today's contemporary Chinese political order led by the CPC, if we go into the origins of the CPC around in 1921, you talk about how it drew inspiration from the Bolsheviks, and then there was a convergence between Soviet Union's Communist Party and the CPC. So how did that feed into China's contemporary political system? And can we consider that as the root of the divergence between India and Chinese political orders?
Well, there are many reasons why there is a difference in the way India has evolved over history, including contemporary history, and the way China has evolved. Now, both India and China were confronting the challenge of the West. So if we are looking at, say, towards the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, you have the struggle against, not only Western domination, political domination, but also the cultural challenge, which was posed to these very traditional societies. So how is it that they have been able to use, say, technology, modern weapons of war to dominate us, to suppress us? So one reaction to that, both in India and China, was, look, unless we adopt Western knowledge, unless we adopt Western technology, we may not be able to actually deal with this challenge. It was a similar kind of a reaction in India too. After all, you have an English-speaking elite which developed over a period of time, became educated in Western universities or in Western disciplines, and they formed the new elite. They led the struggle against the West. Similarly, in China, there was, how do we deal with this Western challenge? Just as in India, there was this challenge, so was it in China. Now, in China, the part of the problem was that those who were saying, well, like Japan, we need to be able to understand Western knowledge, understand Western technology, and we should strengthen ourselves. Another group was saying, no, the reason why we are weak is because we have forgotten traditional Chinese culture, we have forgotten traditional Chinese strengths. Even as far as technology is concerned, we have had an ancient history of developing a lot of technological innovations. Why can't we actually do this? So there was always this tension that on the one hand, you are looking at the Western countries as the source of strength that you need in order to deal with that challenge. But at the same time, you have this huge overhang of your own traditional culture that you don't want to abandon, because that's part of your identity in a sense. Now, it is at this point of time that Bolshevism came into China. And in a sense, it solved that particular contradiction, because this was still a Western ideology. Even though it was communist ideology, but it was very Western. And it was also an instrument of modernization. After all, this is what the Soviet Union then was doing. So in a sense, this contradiction was partly resolved by saying, yes, we borrow from the West, but we borrow from the West, which has been, in a sense, cleansed of the imperialist, sort of character and its oppressive character. Because Marxism and Bolshevism was all about equality, egalitarianism. It was about bringing about modernization of societies through reliance on the so-called proletariat. So in a sense, it allowed China to resolve this tremendous problem of how a traditional society should transform itself, but not be, in a sense, identified with the oppressor. Because it's the oppressor who has the knowledge, it is the oppressor who has the technology. So this was one of the ways, as I said, that China resolved that issue. So Bolshevism became a very important force for transformation of China. In India, it was different. In India, we did not go through that kind of a revolutionary phase. As I said, it was essentially an elite across India, which was educated in English, which we even became aware of its own past through English. And that is how, the whole sense of nationalism, the nationalist movement began in India. So we went on a different path. China went on a somewhat different path. So this is what I try to bring out in the book.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now I would like to bring your attention to the century of humiliation. And we have written that China had a very negative perception of India based on British Indian army soldiers participating in the opium wars against China. So, and also that could have, and I'm quoting you here, that all these incidents led to an impression that India could be a springboard for a foreign power to attack China. It was not important. India was not important in itself, but it could be a springboard. Is this one very particular observation feeding into Chinese perceptions, Chinese behavior, attitudes towards India? And this has been justified by Indian participation in these Western constructs, the Quad, IPAEF, etc. So could you talk about this history?
Yeah, so again, we go back to the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, where I have said that China once again confronts India after a very long gap. So the China develops a very ambivalent view of India. Ambivalent because it recognizes that through history, India, like China, was a civilizational state. It was a center of great advanced culture. After all, Buddhism came from India to China. Many Chinese came to India to learn from masters in Nalanda University or Vikramshila University. So there is that memory of India, which was a very advanced center of culture and knowledge and civilization. But then India has fallen into becoming a slave nation. It is now dominated by an alien power. And what has happened is that India becomes the springboard for British depredations against China. So Sun Yat-sen says, for example, that Britain without India is nothing. The reason why Britain is a threat to China is because it has India in its empire. And it is able to use the resources of India, the people of India, for its imperialist ambitions. So in that context, what happened during the Opium Wars, for example, that the soldiers who were used by the British in order to attack and assault the Chinese were Indian soldiers. Or those who, for example, who were policing the concessions, the British concessions in Shanghai, were Indians. So this is how that very negative impression developed. One, that Western powers are able to do this to China, not because India is a threat, but because India under somebody's rule becomes a threat. So if this is part of the way in which they are interpreting history, so if you come to the present, it's the same thing. We don't think that India is a threat to China. India is a minor league player, as I said. But if India becomes a kind of a base for the Americans, or if it becomes a base in the old days for the Soviet Union, which was then, anti-China, then this could be a danger to China. Therefore, it is in China's interest to keep India separated from these major powers who could be hostile to China. That is the reference.
So thank you, Ambassador, for this insight and this makes me think that in terms of policy implications for your book, uh, should India even care about, having a peaceful coexistence or, resolving differences as an equal with China, or should it continue in its current part? And is it in Indian best interest to try to contain China? Because historically differences do not seem to be resolvable. So what is your take on this?
We should never believe that problems can never be solved. That is certainly, as a diplomat, nobody will accept that we are faced with a situation where we cannot forever cannot solve problems. Of course, we should constantly be making that effort to try and see how we can bring about a more balanced kind of relationship, not just with China, but with other countries as well. So the first order of business is that, as I said, you need to be able to understand what lies behind Chinese thinking. What are the drivers of Chinese behavior towards India? Because if you don't understand what those drivers are, if you don't understand what are the well springs of why China is adopting a certain posture to India, how can you go about trying to change it? It is only only when you understand why it is behaving in a certain way, why is it saying what it is saying, that you can try to change that situation. Okay. Also, it is not just India which needs to understand China. I have said that China also needs to understand India, because China does not. I have shown how, certain misperceptions of India have developed. So even when we are talking about independence of India, we may not have considered it to be very strange that we had, say, the first Governor General of India was still the British Viceroy. He continued to be the Indian head of state for almost more than a year after India became politically, technically independent. We retained the Indian civil service. We retained the British Indian Army. So from their perspective, these showed that India was not independent. Okay, so we should understand why there is this perception. And therefore, if it is a mistaken impression, then how do I try to change it? But if you do not know that these impressions are there, then how do we change it? So it is important for you to understand China, but it is also important for China to understand you, which can only come through greater engagement, greater dialogue, greater conversations. Only then you begin to understand why there are certain differences in perspective. So there is nothing inevitable about an India-China conflict. There is nothing inevitable in terms of enmity between India and China. It all depends upon the context in which we are looking at the relationship. And IR theory itself tells you that today's enemy can be tomorrow's friend and vice versa. So we should not take things as if they are written in stone. It should be our effort to try and see how we can start chipping away at what may be stereotyped images, or maybe images which are based on prejudice, not on fact. So I think that, as I said, even if it seems difficult, we need to be able to engage with each other. We need to be able to try and understand each other. And maybe you will not be able to remove all the divergences between the two sides. But if some of the things which have arisen mainly because of misperception, mainly because of misunderstanding, at least those can be corrected. Therefore, the level of hostility between the two countries can diminish. And that itself will be a plus point.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I would love to draw your attention to one last question. This is about the third historic party resolution under Xi Jinping. And now there's a huge, as you point out in your book, there's a huge difference between what the resolution that came out under Deng Xiaoping and the one under Xi Jinping in terms of collective responsibility, decentralization, one person rule, limits on that term. So we are seeing one sense of insecurity in Xi Jinping in China recently with a lot of things. And now couple that with the civilizational narrative that China has, and then contemporary events, for example, the trade war, then expansion of the USA in its activity in the Indo-Pacific, which is trying to constrain China. So these things are feeding into that civilization narrative. Then it is also breeding insecurity. And so is all of this an outcome of did all of this result in the third party resolution? Or how do you see this? And what is the future of CPC going forward, given all these different variables playing out?
China says that the trajectory that they have followed over the last, say, 40 years or so have brought them to a position of unprecedented power and influence. As I said, I mean, it is a fact that they are the second largest economy. It is a fact that the number one trading partner for a very large number of countries across the world is China. China's influence certainly has grown because it has far more resources to be able to deploy. Take, for example, the South Asian neighborhood, whether it's Nepal or Pakistan or Sri Lanka or the Maldives. We are unable to match the scale of resources that China is able to bring to these countries. So there is a sense in China that there has been a kind of a trajectory through which we have become one of the most influential countries. And therefore, Xi Jinping has said that we are living in an era where changes unseen in a century are taking place. That's the phrasing he uses. Okay, that changes that we have not seen in a century, those kind of changes are taking place today. So these are unprecedented changes. Then he explains this also by saying that these changes, unprecedented changes, are in one respect the change in the balance of power. That is, the balance of change, balance of power has changed in a very dramatic fashion. What does he mean by that? He means that China has become the number 2 country and is probably likely to become the number 1 country. Thirdly, he says, which is very important, these changes that have taken place unseen in a century are irreversible. That is, these are not temporary changes. These are not tactical shifts. There is a certain strategic change that has taken place as far as geopolitical equations are concerned. So, in that sense, what the resolution is trying to do is to reflect this dramatic, this strategic change. That it is unlike what happened, very major changes took place when the first resolution was adopted. Very major changes took place in history when the second resolution was adopted. After all, the whole reform and opening up program began with the second resolution. The third resolution is being also put forward because we are again at a turning point in history. So, on the one hand, as I said, it is reflective of that perception in China that something very significant has changed, very dramatic has changed. And therefore, we need to be able to understand it, and we need to have the right kind of ideology, the right kind of perspective to take full advantage of this. So this is education of the Chinese Communist Party as to why this is such a historic occasion. Okay? So this is something that has to be understood. Now, of course, something which is not only true of China, but may be true of other countries as well. The more powerful a country becomes, the more powerful a leader becomes, his sense of anxiety also increases. His sense of insecurity also increases. So there is always this contradiction of power. The greater the power, the greater the sense of insecurity, because you have to defend something much more significant, much more important than you had before. So both these things you see in China. On the one hand, there is arrogance of power. There is that sense of confidence that our time has come. But at the same time, as you said, you see a great deal of insecurity. Oh, people are trying to contain us. People are trying to isolate us. If you are so confident of yourself, if you are so powerful, then why should you be afraid of people trying to, contain you? How can you be contained? So this contradiction will continue. It is not something which is, in a sense, very surprising. But whether or not the Chinese assessment that this dramatic change has taken place, has it really taken place? That is the question to ask. And in that sense, what does Ukraine do? The Ukrainian war. So if you take, say, the China-Russia joint statement of February 4, 2022, during the time of the Beijing Olympics, Winter Olympics, what does that statement show? The statement shows a convergent assessment of both Russia and China, precisely what Xi Jinping has been saying, that something dramatic has happened. So they are making an assessment that look what has happened with the United States of America and Western Europe in dealing with the pandemic. We have been able to do such a great job in containing this. Look at the complete chaos in, say, the United States and in Western Europe and many other parts of the world. Secondly, look at what has happened in Afghanistan. The chaotic manner in which the Americans and the West have had to withdraw. US may be powerful still, but US has lost the will to fight. So it doesn't have the stomach for a fight anymore. If you look at Europe, Europe is divided and is not able to act as a kind of a cohesive force. Their economies are in the decline. So whether it is the US after the global financial and economic crisis, or whether it is Western Europe, all of them are beset with very major economic problems. By contrast, China has done a great job in dealing with the pandemic, has done a great job in recovering its economy, has done a tremendous job in maintaining social stability. And the alliance between China and Russia is a very powerful way of really keeping the West at bay. So this is what runs through that joint statement. Now, what the Ukraine war has done is that those assumptions that were made by both China and Russia, those assumptions are now suspect. Why? Because what was expected to be a few days, Russia would be able to overcome Ukraine. The message would be go very loud and clear to the West that, better not try to cross us. That message will go. The United States of America will become even less influential, less important in Europe. Russia would be able to hold the line as far as expansion of NATO is concerned, and the West will have no alternative but to bring Russia into any kind of European security order, not as a marginal player, but as a very key stakeholder. So there were several objectives in that. And of course, China would have thought that with this, their ability to dominate Asia would also be then enhanced. Now, it is those assumptions which have become now suspect, if not entirely dispelled, but they have certainly become suspect. So then China is feeling the heat because it may have miscalculated in entering into such a very major kind of an alliance with Russia in the expectation that Russia would prevail very quickly in Ukraine, which has not happened. Secondly, the manner in which Russia has been, in a sense, unplugged from the global economy is also a matter of great worry for China. Because it is still, as I mentioned right in the beginning, its own prosperity is a creature of globalization. Therefore, if it is also unplugged from the global economy, what would happen to China? So there is a certain element of defensiveness which we see currently in China's posture. They are not as confident as they were earlier. And this has also probably generated some internal tensions in China, because Xi Jinping has been associated with a certain policy with regard to Russia. Now, if that Russian bet has gone bad, obviously this will reflect on Xi Jinping's leadership. Similarly, there are various economic problems which have cropped up in China, partly because of the zero COVID policy, again associated with Xi Jinping. You see economic dislocation because of Xi Jinping's actions against the property market, against, for example, the platform economies like Alibaba or Weibo or other major, very successful multinationals. So if the economy is going down, if there is social unrest because of zero COVID policy, even the foreign policy field, the Russian bet has gone bad, then obviously I would imagine that there would be also political tensions within the leadership. How it will play itself out? Of course, we have to wait and see.
And last comment, will this create space for India to, maneuver in this Russia-China axis?
Of course it does, because it reduces the pressure on you, obviously. Secondly, those who are, because of the Ukraine war, are far more now sensitive to what China is doing. China has had, in a sense, it shares the opprobrium which now devolves on Russia. So if Russia is in the dock because it has attacked an independent country, any association of China with Russia also gives it a certain kind of blame. So there is no doubt that China is, relatively speaking, somewhat on the defensive. And therefore, it takes some of the pressure off you. So that is one aspect. Second aspect is, because of the change of perception in the West, particularly Europe, regarding China, because China has so very explicitly allied itself with Russia, which Russia, the West Europeans and many other Europeans are looking at as the new big adversary. Obviously, their attitude towards China has also changed. Therefore, when they see the emerging geopolitical landscape, in that geopolitical landscape, India becomes very important, relatively speaking, because it is seen as the only country which has the credible potential to be able to act as some kind of a countervailing force to China. So you can use this geopolitical moment, as I have said in the book, for the transformation of India itself. Because the only long-term way in which you can deal with the China challenge is to become a very strong country yourself, and which you have the potential to. So if you have a benign partnership with the West at this point of time, with, say, the United States, with Western Europe, with Japan, then can you leverage that to get capital, to get very high technology from these countries, to have access to their markets in order to bring about, as I said, the transformation of India? That moment of opportunity is there, potentially. Of course, we have the history of shooting ourselves in the foot all the time. So maybe we will do the same again. But potentially, yes, that opportunity is there.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And just to summarize this interview for our audience, I would just say that we must look at China's contemporary behavior from the historical lens through which it sees itself, understand where the gaps in this historical trajectory, and only then will we be able to, understand where is this relationship heading, to predict its behavior and manage this relationship. And also what the Ukraine war and the churning, the fractures in the global order portend for China is something which is panning out, and is something that India should continue to monitor and maybe, if possible, exploit this geopolitical space moment that is coming up, that is emerging. On this note, thank you so much, Ambassador, for interacting with the Geostrata.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All the best.